it's a cold, cold world. A cold one, it's a cold, cold world. Yeah. It's a cold, cold world. A cold one, it's a cold, cold world. Yeah. I've been looking to the stars like I'm a national, and this pain hurts so much, so I smoke that gas a lot. I've been hiding from myself, cause I tryna get caught, and you know I write my wrong.
Annapolis had that, but the spittoons they were called. They're really
Okay. Okay. Hold on. Hello, family. Hello, family. We're back tonight, and this is a special edition. Right now, we have Senator Michael Bowman Mitchell, and I tell you, this is an honor. You talking about a hero? He's my hero. He's my hero because a lot of people that I'm just gonna say a little bit about myself before we get to you, Senator. I was raised poor. I was raised with nothing. I was raised with the man that's keeping you down. I was raised somebody who's always keeping you down. But then I did my studies. Once I went back and studied where we was from and where I came from. If you don't know your past, you don't know where you're going in the future. So I did a study for where I came from, and I studied the past about our my civil rights leaders, and I studied a man that the senator was familiar with, which is Thurgood Marshall. And I even studied his Thurgood Marshall's mentor, which was was Charles Hamilton Houston, and the things he went through to get to what he wanted. And some people I talk to people all the time, and people come to me and say, Dennis, they're doing this, and I can't do this because they're doing this. And I look where we came from and the things that Senator, his family did. And I know I have no excuse for nothing that I'm doing. To me, it's not a black and white thing. The reason is, to me, it's not a black and white thing now, because black and white does not hold anyone down now. Only thing that holds a person down now is themselves. But in his time, and when there was coming up, there was a black and white thing. There was things going on that we could not do, that today we have no excuse. So with no further ado, and that's why we made this podcast for you, because without you, this podcast it couldn't even exist. So from the bottom of my heart, I'm going to say thank you. So with no further ado, I'm gonna let Senator take this mic and say it's yours, and it's yours. It's yours.
All right, I'm going to try to start by saying what the old preachers used to say was that the mind can only absorb what the seat can endure. So
okay, go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
I speak from my heart, and the only caveat I have to what you said was that it's still black and white.
Okay,
unfortunately,
I agree with
because of what you look at the support of Trump throughout the country and what's happening, and there still is.
I just want to make a rebuttal on that. On the rebuttal I want to make on that is this: when I say there is black and white. But what I'm saying is,
I understand exactly what you're saying. There's no excuse now.
That's the only
to not achieve is what I'm saying. No, I understand what you're saying.
That was my point only. Go ahead.
But I describe it as a black. That's
fine.
That's why I said a caveat as opposed to an exception.
Yes, there you go. I agree. I agree with you.
I just enlarge upon what you said.
There you go. I agree with you 100%. Go ahead.
But it's still very much that. And just as you see what's happening on college campuses between those in favor of Palestine and the Israeli group.
Yes, I don't even follow. I don't know what's going on with that, but go ahead.
It shows us the great divide in the world.
Yes, that's true.
But I come from a family of freedom fighters, as I told you earlier, and that I'm so blessed that I did. And, you know, the first thing my grandmother used to sit down and tell us that you are not a Negro. That was the term used back in the 40s and 50s, well, really from the 1900s forward. They call us Negroes.
Yes.
She said they described a Negro who would lie, steal, cheat, incapable of learning.
Yes.
She said, you're not one of those things.
Ignorant.
She said, you are an American of African descent.
Yes.
And I just kept listening to her, and that so intrigued me.
Yes.
Because there was all these other people, when I went to integrated school, they had the St. Patrick's and Columbus days and everything, but I had no African holiday to celebrate. And but fortunately, I knew enough about Africa because my father who went to Lincoln University, his first roommate was Kwame Nkrumah.
Okay.
That became president of Ghana.
Yes.
And so I went to see him invested there. And then his second roommate was Benazikwe, who became the first president of Nigeria. And I remember being there in Lagos when President Ezekwe said, "We're throwing off the British shackles." And they became two of the early countries to be emancipated and remove all the colonials out of it. And then my grandmother's intrigued. She said that she told this oral history of this African coming to Maryland, and and she got it right down to the T and described his journey and whatever have you, and that he had purchased land in Montgomery County, Maryland, because the Quakers, it's a group of Quakers who didn't believe in slavery. Some of them did, and they allowed him to buy land and whatever have you. But out of all of it, he had a lot of children, and 42, as a matter of fact, and 3 wives, which is so interesting because we're a prolific bunch. So I said it's probably passed down through our DNA.
I got you.
But my middle name is Bowen, and that's why I used my full name, and it's B-O-W-E-N. But I found out that B-O-W-E with the French accent to go over the E is really Swahili. And when he came to this country, they changed it to the Welsh Bowen, B-O-W-E-N.
Okay.
So, but its roots are in Swahili language, which is fascinating. And so I made it to Ethiopia, and I've been all along in Zimbabwe. That's the other place my family roots come to, and Angola. But this insatiable appetite I had was further fueled by those trips to Africa with my father, and because all the textbooks going to a segregated school showed that these Africans were scantily clad, and they were running around with spears, and then there was even versions, some of the textbooks even put Tarzan in with a monkey, chasing all of us through Africa. And so this was the derogatory, and then so we went to Africa, and there was, in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah was sitting on an incredible throne, dressed impeccably, and then we had learned that the Queen of Great Britain ruled the world, and that everybody bowed and curtsied to her. But then this was when Elizabeth, she was the youngest queen. She was made queen, I think, at like 22 or 23. And this little skinny white woman came up to him, and she curtsied in front of him. And he did not move an inch. And I leapt from my seat. I can remember my father's hand grabbing my belt to pull me back to my seat.
So did you
but it was an epiphany for me.
You saw this with your own eyes?
With my own eyes to see, and that's where I first met Maya Angelou, and I met Malcolm X.
Oh my God!
I mean, I was 12 years old.
Oh my God!
And so this, and then I went to school, went back to this junior high school, and it was called Pimlico Junior High School. And I was raised in, a history class that the President Kwame Nkrumah, there's a government in Ghana, and he had a suit and tie on, whatever have you, and the Queen of England curtsied to him. And then I got sent to the principal's office for lying to the class. And it was the most incredible.
way.
I was actually written up as lying to the class. This is a racist teacher.
So I got a question. Let me ask you a question. So you went over to Africa to see this?
Yes, my father took my oldest brother, Senator Clarence Mitchell III, and myself to Ghana, to Accra, Ghana, to witness his classmate and roommate becoming president. And then throughout the early years, President Nkrumah stayed at our home. He never slept in bed. Because there were no hotels for Africans to stay in because of segregation, discrimination, Jim Crow in this country. So they would always stay, and it was just both he and Benazikwe. They would both come in, and they would go to the 3rd floor, and they had a little bedroll. He would roll out, maybe sleep, and at 6 in the morning he'd be back up, and whatever have you. And so, but I got to know him, and so it was quite something for me. And then when I couldn't wait to get back to school to talk about my African heritage, know. And then that was my epiphany. So I knew then that it was important that what my grandmother was trying to say, that we are somebody, we are.
We are.
And that then I started learning about African civilization and how, and then Lucy's Bones, where everybody comes from Lucy's Bones. They
Explain, I know what it is, but explain Lucy Bones.
Well, Lucy Bones had made a discovery that this is it's right where in the Sudan and really the Ethiopian area of right at the Red Sea and all of that. But there was an archaeologist that discovered these bones, and it was an African woman.
Yes.
and they labeled them Lucy's Bones, and they were certified. Everybody in the world now knows because they used carbon dating and then some more sophisticated kind of dating to show that these are the oldest remains of a human being found on Earth.
What was the date on them? Do you remember?
I don't remember the date, but it was like 6,000 BC, something like that.
I think the oldest bones they found, you can quote me, I think the oldest bones they found was like 200,000 years old.
Yeah, but that might be correct. But I just know that Lucy's Bones.
Yes.
And that they're all Africans. Because you'll constantly hear, every once in a while in the paper, that somebody from Europe will say they found some carvings on a cave to show that these were sophisticated white people up there in Germany and in France and Russia and all this kind of stuff. And they just won't, recognize and accept the fact that they're all African.
Yes.
If you go to Central or South America, or just go to Mexico, everybody has an African heritage because the Africans came here long before Columbus. And if you look at some of the Aztec temples, you look at some of their sculpture,
the statues.
These Africans, and who they have. These weren't Indians; these were Africans described in their sculpture. So. It is important to know that we are the basis of humanity, and that we are somebody, and that's why it will give resonance to young men and young women to know that they come from an incredibly rich tradition and civilization. You know, the whole art of smelting iron was iron ore and developing it so that it could be used into steel. Was developed in the ancient kingdom of Ghana, not the present-day country of Ghana, but the kingdom of Ghana. And the various African queens who were women, but they were called kings. Yes. And they fought harder than the men. Yes. And, but in fact, even Socrates writes about what Africans did and all of his things. And if you go to look at early Greek writing and and sure enough, even Caesar in the Roman Empire, he got away. Cleopatra was a sister. So the Nubians, she came from the Nubians, who were the forerunners of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are just the result of the Italians and some other people coming in and raiding and then breeding with all these African women. So that's, and we have to constantly challenge people because they're forever trying to, they're revisionists is what they're called. They try to change and rewrite our history. And that's why we've got to tell our history and tell it with such detail that is,
Excuse me. Look. Okay, I was even wrong. We have Maria. She's on, right? We're gonna let you finish. But Lucy is in Ethiopia, which is in Africa. Listen, Lucy was 3 million years old.
Okay, but then that's good. Thank you, Maria, because I deferred to him. I just know that these are the human, but she was from, the bones were found in Ethiopia.
3 million, but that's still in Africa,
3.2 million years. So, and these are human. Because that was before the hominids and all that kind of stuff happened. But thank you so much
Thank you, Maria. We appreciate it. But go ahead.
Dennis dragged me back on to
drag you, Senator. Come on, you hurt my feelings.
But I thought I'd engage in some discussion because it's in me. And this is the best way to communicate. Because a lot of people don't read now. And people get their information off of these platforms.
Can I ask you a question, though?
So therefore we use it.
What is your favorite book, though? Because you say, what's your favorite book?
My favorite book is Souls of Black Folks.
I never heard of
W.E.B. Du Bois.
W.E.B. Du Bois. I got to read that. Okay.
You got to read.
I got to read Souls of Black Folks. I never. Yes. Okay.
I have a picture on my phone of my dad was W.E.B. Du Bois, and I met Dr. Du Bois.
Man.
He was one of the first blacks to get a degree from Harvard.
Man.
And he took the position that blacks could be educated, they could go to college and do all sorts of things. But Booker T. Washington was of the mind that we should be restricted to manual things. And that's why Tuskegee was endowed the way it was, because all of the Rockefellers, all of the other people, Vanderbilts and them, gave millions of dollars to Booker T. Washington to keep us from getting a college education.
No way.
So they made the Tuskegee Institute on how to become a maid, how to plow the fields and all of that kind of stuff.
I did a study on I do my personal studies when I go to study something. But I did a study on Booker T. Washington, and I just talked about Booker T. Washington about a couple of episodes ago, how he worked in West Virginia. He walked 600 miles from West Virginia back to Hampton University, and he talked to the he talked to the administration to get into Hampton, and then he formed Tuskegee University. But what you're telling me now is...
Yeah, he did a terrible disservice to black people and the race, because it lowered people's expectations a little. And more importantly, it reinforced the whole white notion that
we can't learn.
A Negro
we can only be slaves.
Incapable of learning.
I didn't know that.
And so
I didn't know that.
That's why you got to be... In fact, his papers at Johns Hopkins University, you ought to go to the library and read it. Not until later in life did he start writing letters that he regretted what had happened. And he... unfortunately, died from some disease he caught from his white partner in New York. But but Dr. Du Bois he was called the leader of the race. Because he said, no, we're just as capable.
I like
and
that
we
better.
can do anything we want to do.
Yes.
And that's how then the Methodist Church, because the states wouldn't provide colleges for blacks.
Yes.
So that's how all of these black schools came about. AT&T, North Carolina Central, Shaw, Clark University, and Spelman, and they were all church schools. And in Maryland, you had University of Maryland. It was called Princess Anne Academy. But it was a 4-year college, and then it became Maryland State, and then it became suddenly under the university system, University of Maryland Eastern Shore. But these were poor Methodists. Morgan State University was Morgan College. But Dr. Carl Murphy, who was a German teacher at Howard University, and came to become the publisher of the Afro-American newspaper, which was a fighting newspaper.
Was he a white guy with German? Was he white?
No, he was black. And the Murphy family here in Baltimore, you might know that one of the attorneys.
I'm not familiar.
But you got to read the history of Baltimore. This seminal figure, Dr. Carl Murphy, who his great granddaughter would be his great granddaughter or granddaughter really is the publisher now of the Afro-American News, and that's Draper, and she's also a minister. But still, the Afro is online now, but it's the oldest continually published black publication in the United States. And so that was how we learned news. And he opened the paper not only in Baltimore and had it going strong, but also in Richmond, Virginia. They were in Philadelphia, and then one time in New York. And at some point they were west. I forgot the name of the city they were in there. But as we read, because there was no television and even radio then, you only had Amos and Auntie, and my father would whip us if he caught that anybody was listening to Amos and Auntie. There was no television, but this was a radio that sat in the living room of our home at 1324 Druid Hill Avenue. And so we learned from that, that something's wrong with these people imitating, and using black. It just was a condemning of us that we were refer further reinforcing this whole nation, about us.
Mm-hmm.
And then we couldn't look at the Little Rascals, because then they had buckwheat.
Yeah, I remember.
And other characters that were no good, and the Amos and Andy thing was just so horrendously racist. But we also, growing up in Baltimore City, there was a restaurant called Wilson Seafood.
Okay.
This was a restaurant on the corner of North Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue.
Okay.
And if you ever just drive by it has been black since whenever.
Yes.
And here they had nerve enough to have an all-white restaurant right in the middle of the black ghetto.
Oh, man.
That only served white people sitting down,
Mm-hmm.
and only blacks could give it was carry out.
Oh, man.
That's horrendous. And then there was a Jewish delicatessen called Nate's and Leon's, which is at North and Linden Avenue.
Okay.
And I never forget, they were supposed to have the best chicken salad sandwiches and all of this kind of stuff, tuna fish and things, getting on rye bread and whatever. And but you could only carry out. If you want to go to a movie, you had to sit in the balcony. And so we didn't go to any movies downtown at the Town Theater or the Hippodrome Theater. The Hippodrome today now has legitimate theater.
Where was that located?
But back then it was a segregated theater that blacks could only sit in the balcony. Thank God my parents had the courage to say, no, we're not going to that. And the only movies you could go to was a Met movie that was at, now imagine, now here's an all-black movie that is juxtaposed and just diagonally across from an all-white restaurant. Where you could only get carry-out. Now, this is in the heart what we're exposed to. And so I knew, and then we couldn't go above North Avenue. If anyone knows the boundaries, and then there was a lawyer, a black lawyer named George McMecken, and he finished Yale Law School and came back to Baltimore to practice.
Okay.
And if you know the McCullough Street, which is at McCullough and North, it is an all-black street now. But back then, in the 30s and 40s, it was all white. And just above North Avenue. And everything below was black. And that was the dividing line. And he purchased a house in the 2300 block of McCullough Street. And within moments of him moving in, the black tar was smeared on the front of the house and his white marble steps, and then they even tried to set it on fire and did all sorts of things because they wanted to keep, blacks from coming into the neighborhoods. Baltimore City was the first city in the nation to enact a residential segregation ordinance in 1910. Wow. And creating that if blocks were, 51% white, that no blacks could move in, and that kind of thing. And then even Baltimore later on for public housing, even built segregated public housing. The black housing went in Cherry Hill, and then the black housing went in high rises. So you had people living on top of one another on 14, 15-story buildings, and then they're caged in. It's like there's a fence that covers, if you went close, that's the only thing that protected you from falling off the 14th floor was a iron fence. And so imagine a child growing up, you have to be fenced in where you lived, as if you're not capable of associating with anyone else. So it's important that we go back and understand this history, and that Baltimore was a slave town, and Maryland was a lynch state, it was called, because the last African American who was lynched in America was George Armwood, which I mentioned to you before, in 1933. And in 1931, Matthew Williams was dragged from a hospital and lynched in Salisbury. And George Armwood was lynched in Princess Anne. And from that background, and then my mother, Juanita Jackson Mitchell, founded, and she was brilliant because she went to the same elementary school because of segregation. They wouldn't put money into the black schools as Thurgood Marshall. But she was very smart. She skipped a number of grades, so she started out being about 4 years behind Thurgood Marshall. She ended up being a year behind him when she graduated from Douglas High School. And she graduated at 14 years old. And she went to Morgan State University, which was then called college, which was a struggling Methodist school.
Okay.
And it was trying to make it, and that's when Dr. Carl Murphy, who was chairman of the board as well, tried to get the state to support it. But she was there 2 years, and my grandmother, Dr. Lily Mae Carroll Jackson, who believed in education and that we were somebody, the one who said that we are Americans of African descent. And she always preached in me, and she would sing that song, oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. And, you know, that's the spirit that I grew up with, that we are something special.
We are special.
So that, and then you get out, and when people do something wrong because of your race, you challenge them. And more importantly, that's what caused me to get involved in the Synod movement. And but then my father told he would travel to branches around the country speaking on NACP matters. And I told you about my father's authorship of the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which established the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office, allowed them to then go after civil rights complaints all over the country. It was reinforced and expanded in the 1961 Civil Rights Law. And then the masterpiece of his legislative effort, well, one of the masterpieces was the 1964 Public Accommodations Law. And out of that, you look at all the sections, and you know, all of a sudden, when he said he got on a plane one time, and all the white stewardesses began to clap for him because he removed height restrictions so women could become police officers and be in the armed services and do all sorts of things and fly airplanes. This is significant. And know that out of that bill then became Title VII, which was the Employment Discrimination Act. And it showed how ingrained racism is in this country, where there had to be the constant challenging of major employers to show that when blacks get there, suddenly a black would be in a position, and then a young white would come in, and then the black would have taught the young white everything to know about the job.
They'll be there, come their boss.
As part of the whole scheme to keep us from being promoted, they would then put in the white person who had just gotten there as the temporary supervisor. And then knowing that the supervisor was about to retire. So that when that
position
white supervisor retired, you had to have, as part of the job description, you had to have past supervisory experience. And clearly the white got it. And so that was perpetuated all over the country to try to keep us down. But that's why, you know, when you look at that song, Lift Every Voice and Sing, you know, and I always like the lines from the second stanza when it talks about hope yet unborn had died. When hope yet unborn had died, how profound is that statement? And yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the places for which our fathers sighed. So as this is the termination of us, and so we are strong people. But I also said that growing up in Baltimore was like a nightmare because I was selling newspapers and a Jet magazine and an Ebony magazine. These were black publications. And this is how we got on news about what was, that's how I first learned about Emmett Till, a young man from Detroit who'd come down to visit his family in Mississippi. And because they claimed that he did something with this white woman.
And it wasn't even true.
And then it erupted into them coming at night and snatching him from his grandfather's home, and then they finding his a cotton device, meal device, wrapped around his body with barbed wire in that river. And the mother was so strong, she wanted an open casket so that they just made a movie.
They just made a movie of that.
If you go to the American Museum of History and Culture, you'll see that. And that's why they allow no pictures to be taken there, because this is holy ground there. And just remember the number
museum,
of blacks in Mississippi who never got a chance to live beyond their
that
early
museum
years.
You just mentioned. That's the museum in D.C., correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Because
the reason I'm asking, because we got...
It's a National Museum of African Americans. It's part of the whole Smithsonian Institution.
So that's the one in...
Lonnie Bunch, now the first black head of the Smithsonian, he was the founder of the National, and really the key person to help bring it about. And he now is the key person who runs all of the Smithsonian museums, Lonnie Bunch. And so that is, we should note that and celebrate that.
Say
and
his name one more time.
Children should go there.
Lonnie Bunch?
Yeah.
He's running the whole Smithsonian
institution, and you learn that, it's important.
It
and
is.
You go through there and you see it's come from all areas they have, and then they, fortunately, they have a picture of my mother, my grandmother, my Uncle Perrin.
In the museum?
And my father. And because of his civil rights activities and what he had done legislatively, and also my Uncle Perrin because of their fights with the Reagan administration and others.
Yes.
And when he was elected in 1970, becoming the first black congressman from Maryland. And the first thing he did was sue President Richard Nixon
that's a good thing.
to end the Vietnam War, because my Uncle Perrin was a decorated World War II veteran.
Okay.
He said he was just standing on the corner at Pennsylvania and Bloom Street, where there was a famous club called the Sphinx Club, but right next to it was a little thing. It was called Hang on the Wall.
Okay,
and it really was a railing there, and everybody kind of congregated. And the police, during World War II, they were running out of soldiers because they had drafted as many whites as they could, so they then started arresting blacks and told them they had an option of either going to jail
or go to war.
Become a soldier. And so that's how the black ranks fulfilled. And my uncle describes it perfectly as he did to me, that he was standing there with his two brothers. All three of them were arrested and taken down to what was called the Old Pine Street Station in Baltimore, which runs along. The building still stands, and it's runs along Martin Luther King Boulevard. And then the judge told him that, look, you're being arrested for disorderly conduct, and that you either get a year, in the Maryland Penitentiary, or you can join the Army. And of course, all three of them joined the Army. And so my uncle was so brilliant, Uncle Congressman Perrin Mitchell, that he was selected for the officers training school. One of the first.
That's the same one. The picture you gave me. Remember, I have a picture. I haven't posted it yet. But is that the picture that you sent me?
Yes.
That's your uncle in that picture.
Yeah, that's right.
Make sure that you say you want to put some details.
Yeah, I'm going to send you with all the names of the people. So because it's important that you see a lot of photographs from time to time, but I take the time to put names in.
Please do that.
I send it to you without the names today because I didn't get the notice until an hour before.
I understand.
But I had planned to tell you to hold it up until I put the names there, and so you could celebrate that, because these are people who gave their lives and their very fiber. And you're talking about a fiery woman. I have a tape. You should just play for one of your shows of Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman to run for president of this country.
You have you ever met her?
Oh, I have her. Yes, I met her. She was a dear friend of mine. I campaigned for her.
Oh
my Uncle Perrin was in. He and one other congressman, only two that supported her candidacy for president.
Yes.
And
I remember when she ran.
And then they investigated her and made her a wreck because she had the audacity to run for president of the United States. They did everything humanly possible to destroy her life, and which caused her to retire from Congress and not continue to be involved.
But you know what they say, though.
This is the pernicious nature of this racist society.
But you know what they say, though, right? They say if you destroy the name, you can destroy the man.
That's right.
That's correct.
And and imagine, I was 10 to 11 years old.
Okay.
And I just had a week of school. And imagine waking up on a Saturday that I'd hope to get some pancakes and have some bacon there and my mother would have it waiting for me, and then fresh squeezed orange juice. And so I knew I was going to have that. And I came downstairs and heard all this commotion out in front of the house.
Okay.
And who should be picketing us in the heart of the ghetto at 1324 Druid Hoe Avenue? But the Ku Klux Klan had the nerve to come into a black woman and to picket because my father and mother and the family had been involved in civil rights. And the Klan felt empowered because they knew the police weren't going to stop them.
Yes.
They came and then started picketing our home.
Yes.
Were you
scared?
And then my father told me, he says, Dr. King believes in nonviolence. Because this is 60 after the Montgomery movement was 57.
Yes.
And he said, get the hose from the backyard. And so, you know, these old houses, these row houses, have a faucet out front so you could use the hose to clean your front and march down the marble. And he hooked up that hose. And the next thing you know, you had the hand thing that put it on power. And here were all of these Klansmen being rebaptized, running down Druid Hill Avenue, dropping their robes.
For real?
And, oh, this was incredible. I have a picture of it. And people
Can I have that picture? Can you send me that picture also, please?
I will. You know, it's some of it's licensed, and so I don't disseminate some of the things.
Okay. Sounds
good. But I can describe it to you, and at some point I will.
Okay.
And but imagine as a child waking up and everything you've heard about the Ku Klux Klan.
You're scared. That's intimidation.
Would come to my home,
yes.
a safe haven in Baltimore, Maryland.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why Thurgood Marshall called Baltimore, Maryland, way up south in the state, because of the egregious nature of what they did. We have 2 lynchings, the last 2 lynchings in the United States and in Maryland, were the Matthew Williams lynching in 31 and then Armwood in 33, which I've already said. I'm repeating it deliberately so people will remember the names.
I understand.
Then my father then told me to get the shoe polish, and we always had a lot of placards in the house. And that's what they would do. They would put up, make picket signs, counter picket, and then draw the signs, and then, as my mother said, she had a regular platoon to picket us, and because she would get all 4 boys, and here we would be carrying signs and counter picketing the Klan. And it was one.
Were y'all scared of the Klan?
No, because my father had, we knew from experiences that we were in the middle of the ghetto.
Yeah, okay.
So we knew we had somebody. And if the Klan even knew that with some of our friends would come around, they wouldn't have dared come to
I got you.
And when my father gave me baptism, they started moving. They went down to the NACP office, which was located at 1234 Druid Hill Avenue.
Okay.
Started picketing there. And then the brothers started coming out from the neighborhoods. And there was a guy in the city called Little Melvin. And he was quite a character. In fact, they even he's on the HBO series or something about one of the largest gangsters in the United States. He was a multimillionaire, but he was a brilliant guy. He created, doing numbers, and then unfortunately he got involved in selling of drugs, but he became a multimillionaire. He started coming along with other people, Henry James and all of the kind of people who, Gangster Webster was another guy. And these are just the monikers you knew him by. And one was Little Melvin and Gangster Webster, and others came, and the Klan then started running because they came. Some of them came armed, and some of them with baseball bats, they would. So there was a lot of people coming, and the Klan showed they were all a bunch of people who had no moral conscience and really were opportunists. Were scared, and if confronted with something, they would run.
Yeah, that's why they wore masks, though.
Yeah, that's exactly why because they were afraid to show their identity.
Yes.
But and then my grandfather, Kiefer Albert Jackson, was one of the first black motion picture exhibitors in this country.
Wow.
And he, in the days of silent movies. He made movies and showed them. He had a theater. It was called the Dreamland Theater, and he did it in Memphis, Tennessee. He was born in Carrollton, Mississippi. But growing up as a young man, because they thought he was white, he was so fair. And if you'd seen his family, his sisters, they were all the colors of the rainbow. And he knew then that, and he was finally introduced to his father. His mother brought him in the kitchen. And the father came in and said, "What are you bringing this little nigga in here for?" And he said the first time he met his father, only thing he remembers about his father is his big black boot kicking him against the wall.
Wow.
And he never went back there. And he knew that this is where it all started, in the white man's kitchen. So don't let your daughter, make sure she gets education. Don't let her work in the white man's kitchen. He then was traveling around at various venues and showing silent movies, and he actually created his own electricity. He was brilliant, and you know, I have some of the equipment. You ought to see it that he used to make electricity. And during World War I, they thought he was a German spy. So he had to be careful, and they was always stopped by the police, he said. But growing up in Carrollton, Mississippi, he witnessed the lynching of his fellow black citizens, about 7 of them. He said where the Klan came in, there were no actual windows on the courthouse, so the Klan mounted on these horses rode right into the big windows of the courthouse and lynched all of these blacks right in the courthouse who hadn't even started their trial yet. And he thought that was so wrong that he wanted it. He said as soon as he got old enough, he wanted to leave Mississippi, and he did. And then the rest of his family was part of the Great Migration. I jokingly tell people those who could run fast made it to Chicago, and those who were slow of foot made it to Maryland. But he went and showed these movies, and then his piano player and singer got married. So he was looking around for somebody. He came to Baltimore looking for someone. He boarded with my great-grandmother's home on Druid Hill Avenue. Her name was Amanda Bowen Carroll. Okay. And she had her house was a regular, she was the first black family on Druid Hill Avenue. And she comes from a line, the Bowen line, and she married a Carroll, one of the descendants of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. And so her father...
No, repeat what you just said slowly.
My grandmother, great-grandmother, was married to Charles Henry Carroll, who was the son of Daniel Carroll, who was the son of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Maryland's signer of the Declaration of Independence. And I always wondered how this forebear of mine, and you got to remember that Charles Carroll of Carrollton had left Ireland because of religious persecution, because he was a Catholic, and came here to America, and it came originally, his forebears came to St. Mary's, Canada, then ended up his father owned the biggest estate in Annapolis, and there's a church named for him. But the significance is that he was the largest slaveholder. How could you write those words? All men are created equal. They're endowed with their creators with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then to sign a document that even says that and be the largest slaveholder in the colonies, trying to get freedom from King George.
Guess what, though? I'm glad he did write those words, though. Yeah. Because then they have to stand on them.
Yeah.
When you wrote them, that's how you became the civil rights leader that you are. They wrote those words, but now you stand on them.
Yeah.
But go ahead. I'm sorry.
And then, people always thought that we were a little touched. My grandmother wrote a story for the black newspaper. She said, my forebears. And she laid it all out. But she was proud of the Bowen line.
Yes.
And, there was a thing when we were growing up that... I have a flat nose. My grandmother said, keep that African nose. You know, they actually had something when blacks were growing up to try to have a thinner nose, and people would do 50 times, take the thumb and thumb and do that every day, sometimes 2 times a day to get a sharper nose. And my grandma said, don't you dare keep that African nose. There you go. So be proud of it. And so these are the kind of subtle things that happen.
I understand.
And you got to understand the damage that racism does to our children.
I understand.
If you go back to the Brown versus Board of Education 1954 decision, what really moved that court to be unanimous in rendering that decision, that the segregation in public schools is a violation of the 14th Amendment.
Yes.
And therefore, it was unconstitutional.
Yes.
But the interesting thing was that as part of this, Thurgood Marshall's strategy and the other black lawyers was to bring Dr. Kenneth Clark, who was a psychologist from New York University, a black psychologist. Okay. And they brought him to all of these venues where they were looking at black and white children and interviewing them. And he devised a test to show the irreparable harm that had been done to young black children. Yes. And he brought 2 dolls identically dressed, one white with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the other black and with curly hair. Yes. And showed the little white girl. The first question was, what doll would you like to play with?
Yes.
And she pointed to the white doll.
Yes.
And then he said, well, which doll is the beautiful doll?
Go ahead.
And she put a little finger in her mouth and pointed to the white doll.
Yes.
And then the final question he asked her was, what doll looks most like you? And that little girl looked at Dr. Clark, and again her finger in her mouth,
and then
almost had tears in her eyes,
and had to point at
to the white doll.
Yes.
And there was the irreparable harm that
Yes.
he and this little black South Carolina girl,
Yes.
she thought that here she was, that she wasn't proud of her own skin and her
Yes.
curly hair, but that the only thing
Yes.
beautiful in this world was a white blonde
Yes.
girl with blue eyes.
Yes.
And that was the irreparable harm that
Yes.
really moved the court.
Yes.
And that's the doll test.
Yes.
And people got to go and read about that, because
Yes.
people say, you know,
They
there's a decision.
actually have a video of that. I seen the video. What you just said, I
Yeah.
seen the video of it.
Well, then that's good, because
They have a video
you
of
need
it.
to disseminate. And I say that this is in repeating history, because a lot's going on in this world.
Yes.
But we've got to have, we've got to know about our past to be prepared for the future.
Yes.
And we've got to know the history of racism in this country.
Yes.
And how it's come about and how it's manifested itself.
Yes.
You know, that's the reason that Trump won the first time. And that there's all of this. That's why he's number one in the Republican Party now.
Yes.
Because they're going to keep blacks and keep
you think
Hispanics
he gonna win again?
and other people they don't like and Africans out of America.
Do you think he's gonna win again?
No, I believe he will not win again, because what we're going to do is really organize. In other words, God helps those who help themselves. But if you sit on God, you're going to sit. So it takes prayer and work.
Yes,
and so that we're going to mobilize people in the Democratic Party prepared to have lawyers at various precincts and others, because there's been a wave of voter intimidation statutes and trying to remove blacks from the voters list.
Yes.
And so there'll be a massive registration of blacks, and people are doing that all throughout the South, and especially in the North as well. You'd be surprised. That you've got to make sure here, even in Baltimore City, that things run correctly.
Yes.
And because now there's a state board that supervises elections, and they run things, and sometimes they have a rule that says every 2 years, if you haven't voted or something, every two terms, then you kind of remove. I think it's 3. Eventually, you remove from the voter roll.
Okay.
So you got to be careful. Some people have been voting a long time, figured once they've registered, they're okay.
Yeah, okay, yes.
But that's, again, a manifestation of racism. That here you've taken the time to execute and really exercise your constitutional right to vote. And there's an effort to, because you hadn't voted in 2 elections, you could have been sick or whatever have you, and then you're removed. And you go to vote again, and they don't have your name. And so this is the atmosphere. I grew up in Baltimore, and in order to register to vote, there was no mail-in ballot.
No.
You had to go to first you had to go to City Hall and climb these enormous, if you see the Baltimore City Hall, you see it's about 25 steps.
Okay.
Up to the entrance to City Hall. And they made blacks climb up all of those steps to go in to register to vote. And I have a picture of it.
Okay.
And you should see, imagine the elderly with their canes, and they had enough courage of their convictions to climb those steps.
Was at the same time they had to take one time blacks had to take a test or something to vote?
Oh, but that was primarily in the South. I'll get to that in a moment. But they had insidious tests in Mississippi. In Jackson, Mississippi was famous for having one of the worst tests. The one was that you go in to register to vote, and here the registrar had a whole at that time jar with the kind of lid on it of bubbles, and you had to guess how many bubbles in there.
God.
And if you can guess how many bubbles in,
you don't get the vote. Oh
you
my
could
God.
not register to vote.
Man.
And then other times they just told you couldn't
vote.
And then you had to guess how many jelly beans were in a big jar sitting there, and you can imagine that, And so nobody ever passed those tests. Then they told people read us the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And, imagine that to someone who's been denied an education.
To read.
And so that was, kind of outrageous.
Yes.
But these were the forms used to intimidate people. And then there was another thing they called the grandfather clause. I actually have my aunt's voting certificate that she had to prove that her husband's grandfather had voted in Texas in order to register to vote And it was the most incredible thing to find that. And then I actually have a bill of sale of one relative being sold to someone in Texas. The actual bill of sale, in which I've given it temporarily to the Maryland archives of Maryland, and so I'm going to get that and reproduce it and blow it up so people can see. And you've got to know that we're the only people in the world who really don't know our history. And we don't know where we come from. And I'll never forget, my mother and father had the longest engagement, because back in my grandmother's oral history, there was a Mitchell living with the Bowens in Montgomery County.
Oh, man.
And the Mitchells come from Montgomery County. So she wanted to make sure there weren't any cousins,
related.
And it took exhaustive research by her, which lasted almost 8 years, but they finally got married in 1938.
Okay,
and
awesome.
It was really something that, and then, but my father came from such humble circumstances, and everybody wondered how he got to marry Juanita Jackson Mitchell. They used to call the Jackson sisters the Holy Sisters, because my grandmother said that boys and books didn't mix.
Oh, man.
And that if you even look at a boy, we're going to hang you by your ears. So they do that, and that's how she, just skipped grades and graduated from high school at 14, and then finished the University of Pennsylvania, magna cum laude, at 18 years old. And what she did was, her faculty advisor was the famous sociologist, Dr. Margaret Mead, who was really the person, who really started the modern sociology and set a standard for social work in the United States. She graduated at 18 and then came back to Boston. She couldn't work. But then, after she graduated, my grandmother kept her in school, sent her to Columbia to take some summer courses. But she got all A's in that. So when she came back to Baltimore, she tried to get a job as a teacher, but they wouldn't hire her because she was still 18 years of age. And so then my grandmother said, well, I have something for you to do. I want you to travel with Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and help her with her speeches and letters and that kind of thing. And that's what my mother became, an assistant to Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, and traveled all over the country with her. And I have a photograph of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and another historic woman from Washington, D.C., Mary Church Terrell, who was a forerunner, was a fighter. She was a black Washingtonian, and who came from the upper middle class, but recognized that she had a responsibility to help the race. And so she started a Buy Where You Can't Work campaign in Washington, D.C. So don't buy where you can't get a job. And that came to Baltimore. And there was a guy, his name was Bishop Kiowa Costoni. He was blonde and had blue eyes, but he wore a turban. But he came to Baltimore, and of course, all the women, he attracted a crowd. He was this guy with a turban. But he joined with the Citywide Young People's Forum, which had been organized by my mother to confront racism in Baltimore. And you had all of these, because Maryland was so racist and segregated. Blacks couldn't go to the University of Maryland if they wanted to go to graduate school. But you know what? The state of Maryland would pay for you to go to New York University, would pay for you to go to Amherst, would pay for you to go to Harvard or go to Yale or any place but the University of Maryland, College Park.
Really?
Pay your full fare.
But
that's why all these black teachers were they got these master's degrees from, Columbia and New York University. So these were some gifted, very special black teachers in the schools. And that's how we made it, because even though we had lack of textbooks and other kind of materials, they used that excellent training they received in these Ivy League schools to teach us and show us how to learn. And I remember raising my hand in one class one day. The teacher said, all right, everybody turn to page 34. And I said, Miss Warden, I don't have page 34 in my book. And she would then use what was called a mimeograph machine. That's when they used blue ink, and it would be put on a black film. You got to learn about this because you're an electrician, you're a technical. But then you cranked it by hand, and it actually, you then had to type of this blue ink, what you wanted reproduced, and then you produced the copies by turning the drum.
Matter of fact, I've seen one of those before.
And so that's how I got my page 34.
Oh, man.
And then I went to sit for my first grade, no, really for kindergarten. And I said, "Where's my chair?" And somebody went back and got a milk crate and said, "That's your chair," and because they didn't have enough chairs for the black kids in kindergarten. And then it continued up through almost the sixth grade, and there'd be the worst fights because some of the other guys are a little bit older, in law school, in elementary school. I didn't grow until like probably in junior high school. But I was so skinny, they thought I had tuberculosis. But these guys would come and we get in terrible fights, but my father taught us how to fight. And so I never lost my chair, but I got banged up a lot. But, the indignity of that because they didn't want to give us decent textbooks, pay the teachers salaries. In 1948, Enola Macmillan, who became the president of the National NAACP and was branch president of the ACP, under my grandmother, she filed the suit. Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer on the unequal salaries of black and white teachers in the state of Maryland. And that case went to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, and Thurgood Marshall won that case.
Yes.
So, and they had a terrible example in one of in Prince George's County. The black teacher was paid $600 a year, and the white teachers were paid $3,100. And it was such a vast disparity. This is throughout the state of Maryland, in Baltimore City, everywhere. And so they ruled that unconstitutional, and they had to reform. And then, it was. But these teachers did what they could to give us a sense of who we were. And then I went to a school that was called the Henry Highland Garnett Elementary School. And people got to know about Henry Highland Garnett. He was a bad brother. He went to Princeton University, and he was actually born on the eastern shore of Maryland. But he went up, and then the family moved north, and eventually ended up graduating from Princeton University. And he was an equal orator of Frederick Douglass, but we remember Frederick Douglass more because of his publishing things, and then being where there was a written word of it. There were a lot of speeches that Henry Highland Garnett did, but they weren't written down and republished in certain papers. So, and then there was the whole effort in the 1830s and 40s to get rid of blacks in America. It started right here in Maryland. It was called the American Colonialization Society. And they came up with the idea that their black population of slaves kept increasing, and also because you had Nat Turner in his slave revolt. You got to remember that it wasn't just Nat Turner, but there were over 500 documented revolts by African Americans in this country who didn't want slavery, to be a slave all their life. And what happened was they then were trying to find an alternative to send blacks. And first they chose Haiti, but then they gave up on Haiti, and then they chose Mexico. So they sent a whole lot of black people to Mexico.
Really?
Yeah, I'm telling you, thousands of them. Some people would free their slaves on condition they'd be left, leave the country. And so that's why and then, all of Central and South America was populated, but most of the slaves coming from Africa went to South and Central America.
Really?
So that's why in Brazil, the majority population are African. Brazilians.
Really? I didn't know that.
And also, you look at Colombia, the majority of population are African. And then what happened in Argentina, there were so many Africans there in Argentina that the government decided to start bringing white Europeans over. And so they give them a free ride, pay the expenses, the passage on ship, and a condition to lighten the population. So you suddenly have all of this happening. But you will see it because the way genetics works. You'll see a family, if you go to Cartagena, Colombia, and you see both the mother and the father have light complexion. And then there's a whole line of children. About the fifth child, there's this little brown child with curly hair. That African comes out, and what's going on, what time it is. But these are the things that America did, and so my forebears didn't trust America, and they started sending some of these 40-some children and grandchildren he had to get free passage, a one-way ticket to the Republic, and they helped to found the Republic of Liberia. And they started in the 1830s, and then went on to, the country was actually established in 1847. And on the establishment of the country was the signature of my forebear, John Bowen.
Wow.
And I just cried when I saw that. It just made me feel good. But getting back to my grandfather's Mississippi, I must mention that the state that made it as clear as possible in its articles of secession that the reason they were leaving the United States to engage in a civil war was because in Mississippi, in bold letters, because of slavery. And that was the only reason. And for these people to talk about it was a war about states' rights is the biggest lie ever. Every one of those depended on the slave. Mississippi would have been dirt poor if they didn't have slaves, and cotton was the king. And all of those states had tobacco and other things that went to Europe. And then the rum that came from Jamaica and the other islands and Barbados and everything else. And then most of the other slaves who came to America, very few came to America, but most of them came from Central and South America, from Cuba and other places. But as I look back on this, my father's great-grandmother, who's listed in the that's Clarence Mitchell Jr., and he was of dark hue. My father. He was 6'3", but a bad brother.
Yeah, I got you.
But there was no question about he was a black brother. And because his great-grandmother she had come from Bahia State in Brazil. And her forebear had been taken as a slave from Angola and sent to Brazil to be a slave. And of that woman from Angola, her granddaughter became, her name was Rufino, Grace Rufino, from Bahia State in Brazil. And she came to Baltimore. And it was interesting, there was a whole wave of people who had been in slavery who were able to get out because, first of all, the census people marked her down not as being an African American, but as being a mulatto. And just could imagine that, so therefore everything that flowed from there, no matter the hue of, and both my father and one of his other brothers were very dark. So he was always wondering why the census always, because once it was established that she was mulatto, then everybody that flowed from that.
Was mulatto,
and so, and as a child growing up, I used to wonder what my grandmother was speaking, to some of the older aunts and uncles, and it was Portuguese because they didn't want us to know what was going on. And I finally found out, so that, it's important that you can find out your roots and that kind of thing if you persist, and start digging in records and know who you are. And I really feel good about that, because knowing who I am. In fact, I went to Liberia, and I was able to find all these descendants of the Bowens who left America and to get some freedom. I read a letter that's at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, which is the old Maryland Historical Society, and a letter from this Bowen, who writes back to the family here in America to say, my belly is not full, I don't have any shoes, my clothes are tattered, but I have my liberty. And so that just rung a bell. I read that letter and I just cried there, that here he was willing to forsake all of the amenities of having a good life and go to Liberia and on a one-way ticket.
I got you.
And so that I have probably still now maybe 1,000 or so relatives, because the forebear had 42 children. Those who got sent over there, they were trying to replicate what the forebear did. But and then there was a whole group that had to flee Liberia during the wars. There was a Sergeant Doe and also Charles Taylor, who were warlords. And they came to try to kill everybody. The Americans who came over were called Americo-Liberians. So they were trying to kill my family and everybody else. And so they had to escape to Sierra Leone in Freetown. And then from there, they were able to charter a plane and fly to Boston. So I have another Liberians, another 1,000 of them in Boston.
Okay. Do you connect with them up there in Boston?
Oh, yeah. I went up to family reunion, and it was so fascinating because the Ma B was her name. She was kind of the matriarch of the family, and she had written me a letter when my father had died, and she was expressing her sympathy and said, I'm a Bowen, and you're part of our family.
Okay.
And I looked at that, and so I said, well, my grandma, and she said, coming from Monrovia, Liberia. So I said, that's what my grandmother said.
Whoa.
So I said, Grandma, you're right. And this was long after my grandmother had passed, but I remember those words, and so I had a sense there that things. So I eventually got to Liberia, but again, my brother Clarence M. Mitchell III. He was the only one born in St. Paul, Minnesota. Okay. But he was born in a hospital, in the first Catholic hospital in St. Paul, Minnesota, to integrate and allow black women to have a baby in the hospital. But they almost killed my mother and my brother.
Whoa. And
my father writes a letter, which I will send you. Okay. And because it became a guidepost for us for how we should conduct ourselves in life. But he said, the doctors came to him and said, look, you have to make a choice. Do you want to save your wife or your son? And he said, I'm going to leave it in God's hands. But of course, my mother survived and my brother survived. Awesome. But more importantly, my grandmother, who believed in bringing women from the South who were, midwives and to deliver babies, and no more doctors delivered the rest of us. I was born at Druid Hill Avenue by a lady my father said who was some older people who will understand was sniffing snuff and chewing tobacco and had a bucket full. She spit out her tobacco, but out of all of that, he got a son. Me. And so myself, my brother Kiefer, who became a physician, and my younger brother George, who became quite a real estate developer. So we were all taught that we were special, and I, in my life, had just been so blessed. I wouldn't change a thing. Awesome. I lost my hearing because of participating in a civil rights demonstration, trying to get it going in a sit-in. And, I always opened my big mouth, and the restaurant owner said, this is in a restaurant right next to the state capitol in Annapolis, Maryland. And we weren't even down there to picket the restaurant. We had come to get more money from the state of Maryland for the university, for Princess Anne Academy, University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And we were just coming out to get something to eat. And all of us didn't notice that atop this restaurant there was a Confederate flag flying. So we walked on in, and we just wanted to get something to eat. We thought because my brother had authored a public accommodations law, and Anne Arundel County was included in the law, but 15 of Maryland's counties exempted themselves from the public accommodations law, but the first one. So we go in there, and we all sit at the stools, and imagine they're like black and white students. Some came from Hopkins and other places. Some came from, Sarah Lawrence and other schools up north. They always came and joined in Common Cause when it was picketing something. And I said, I want a hamburger and fries. He said, I don't serve no niggas. And I said, I don't eat them either. And that's when, all hell broke loose. That's when the police started coming with their billy clubs. And in the old Webster's Dictionary, if you look up the term espantoon, E-S-P-A-N-T-O-O-N, it actually has a definition in the old Webster's Dictionary as a terrible bully stick used by Maryland policemen to beat people. And sure enough, they brought out the espantoons and beat us. And as a result of that, I ended up being on the front page of then was called the Washington Star. And the Washington Post wasn't published at that time. And it made Jet Magazine and it went around the country. And I was being beaten by these police. This was March the 16th, 1964. I had gone to Morgan State University 1 year in college. But I then decided that after that experience that I better get serious about college, and I knew that having all the kinds, I was very popular campus and everything, and ran for office and all of that kind of stuff, and there were a lot of women on campus, and to me it was one big party, and so I said, I need to prepare myself if I'm going to do anything in life. And even at that age, I was, 17. I was able to skip a few grades, and so I finished high school at 17. But it was, I knew that based upon what my grandmother had said, that get a first-class education, and you got to come back and help the people. And people look to you to do that. And I said, I better get busy. And so I decided to apply, and I transferred to my father's school, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Awesome. And because of that experience, I got the most significant and worthwhile education anyone could have seen. I could have gotten that education at Harvard, Yale, or any other place. And because these black professors who took an interest and who were so skilled and who had incredible degrees, the only thing was that they had a Dr. Frankowski. He was black, but he taught chemistry. Okay. And as part of the whole pre-medical, everybody comes to college thinking you're going to be a doctor. And I was in pre-med course, and I went ahead and took these chemistry courses, and then they did some other, the other chemistry courses, and then we got into a very significant chemistry course, and I said, I'm giving up on it. I'm going to go become an economist or political scientist. Okay, so I immediately changed my major to then I learned statistics. Okay. And probabilities. Okay. And that was my whole life from then on. Man, that was a magic thing that opened up for me, knowing that you take a chance in probability judging things. Well, I graduated, but before I graduated, a young woman came to sing to us. And her name was Miriam Makeba from South Africa. Okay. And she had this song that made millions of records sold around. It was called Pata Pata. And it was just a very popular song all over the world. Okay. And she was a freedom fighter. She was fighting apartheid in South Africa and described to us what was happening in South Africa. And then you might have heard of Hugh Masekela. No, I haven't heard Hugh Masekela had an incredible, he was a trumpeter, and he had a song called Grazing in the Grass. Okay. And he played the trumpet and cornet. And he went to the Manhattan School of Music, and that's how we met. I was the first black to graduate from Peabody Preparatory here in Baltimore. And I played the oboe, which is a classical instrument. I know the oboe. You still play the oboe? Yeah, I still have it, but I don't play it as much. I used to play it when I was in the city council with the Baltimore Symphony. I didn't know that. But and there were very few composers who did a lot of works that featured oboes. So like the New World Symphony and that kind of thing included long oboe solos. So I enjoyed that. But then I knew that I had to do something else. But I met him at the Manhattan School of Music with Harry, and of course I had known Harry Belafonte. And he introduced me to who he had actually brought Hugh Masekela over from South Africa. Oh, really? And so from then on, and because I played the oboe, he always called me Hobo. And I didn't see. And then it was interesting. He came back to play as a free concert at Lincoln with Miriam Makeba. And she said at the end of the concert, my husband and I are going back to South Africa to fight these people in apartheid. And Hugh Masekela said, my wife is going, but I'm enjoying America right now. I'm staying here. And of course, she said, I'm divorcing my husband. She answered right there. And she ended up marrying Stokely Carmichael, people don't know, who became Kwame Ture. Yeah, okay. And they were married. I was in both weddings. The wedding with Hugh Masekela and her wedding to Stokely Carmichael. Oh, really? And he wrote a book called The Politics of Black Power with Dr. Charles Hamilton, who was a brilliant political scientist from Chicago, and he co-authored it with Stokely Carmichael, The Politics of Black Power. And that's because when Black Power just had come about, and then people who define it, what is it? And then that's the only book I'm at least listed in. My name is printed as being a notes editor. That's good, though. Yeah. I must have bought 10 copies of the show people I got a little bit of education and everything. But I used it. Then I went on from there. I was active. I became the first youth. I was elected at 18 before I went to college as the first youth to be on the national board of the NAACP. And that meant running the entire country to every chapter and whatever have you. Wow. So, I made my rounds, and I overwhelmingly won and became the first and the youngest youth to be on the national board of the NAACP, and which was quite an honor. And so I'm sitting with Roy Wilkins, and my grandmother was on the board at the time, Dr. Lily Mae Carroll Jackson, and all these incredible luminaries who were involved in the civil rights fight. And I was exposed to so much, and then I found Kwesi finally found a book and published a lot of old NACP photos. And here I am, I had a Madras sport coat on. This was one that if you couldn't wear it too much in the summer because the Indian dye would start running on you for restoration. But I had my Madras sport coat on, and here I'm in this picture, and it brought back wonderful and fond memories. It taught me Robert's Rules of Order, how to run things, and those kind of things. But I think that with that African, knowing this, that I am matriculated at a school that my father did, and that Kwame Nkrumah and Ben Ezekwe, and just having met them and gone to Africa at such an early age.
I can imagine.
Oh, and then to be punched by teachers that said I was lying to the class
because
by talking about Kwame Nkrumah and the Queen of Great Britain, and her curtsying in front of him. And so all of that came together. That my brother Clarence was one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was the representative for Morgan State College then, before it became university. Then Tennessee State, which was a black college. You know, any college that says state, it's a black college.
Okay.
And Marion Barry's from Tennessee State. And Julian Bond came in, and he was from the Ivy League school. But his father had been temporary president at Lincoln for a while. But he and my brother, and then there was another person called Lafayette Singleton, who became the chair. And my brother Clarence was the treasurer of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And there's a picture of him that made it. There was a magazine called Life Magazine, and they featured these students coming together to meet with Dr. Martin Luther King in Atlanta, Georgia. At the campus of Morehouse College. And sure enough, it became an incredible picture. And the photographer was the first black photographer for Life magazine. It was a person named Gordon Parks, who came from Minnesota, who'd known my father and mother.
Wow.
And he took that picture. Wow. And I have a copy. I will send you that.
Yeah, please.
And because that's so historic to see all of these people and what Marion Barry did to D.C. to make all these black millionaires and everything else. We owe them an incredible debt of gratitude. And so I was much younger. My brother Clarence was 6 years older than me. Okay. But I tried to hang along, and I did everything I could to try to grow a mustache and all that. And finally, I used to paste hair or something on my chin or something. At least I had to look a little bit older. But so I joined the sit-in students. I would go down and get picketed with them, and then just as we got arrested, they throw me out of the police would because they said, you're not old enough. Well, then...
So you met Dr. Martin Luther King?
Yes, I met Dr. Martin Luther King, and I first met him at my grandmother's house at 1320 Utah Place. And I walked in, and there was my grandmother at her kitchen table, dining room table, and sitting with Dr. King, and he's eating fried chicken. Somebody had potato salad, and somebody had made hot rolls, and he was enjoying himself. And my grandmother had written him a letter to come and speak to the Baltimore branch. And he had deferred, but he wanted to come by and explain, and I have the letter that he actually signed and sent to my grandmother, saying that he couldn't make the first date, but then he agreed to come back again.
You send me a picture of that?
To Baltimore.
Can you send me a picture of that? I know some things you can't, but I love this. I love this. That's why I'm asking for pictures, because go ahead. I'm sorry, but go ahead.
I want you to disseminate them, because you got to spread it so people can know. You hardy souls who listen to me talk ad nauseum.
But as nobody's up there now.
Oh, okay.
It was we just had a couple people, but it's okay.
But still, whoever listens to this will know
they can
that I
still
speak from my heart.
They can still. A lot of people don't chime in, but they can still hear us. 'Cause
Okay.
I tell you, go ahead, finish. Go ahead. I'm not gonna.
No. I just one thing I'll come to right now because before I don't want to keep going and not mention it.
Go ahead.
And I'm skipping over a lot of things
You
to
are,
get to this
but it's
because
okay. It's okay. Go
there's
ahead.
a group called, and I sent you the picture of, and one of whom was part of American Voices Against Apartheid.
Yes.
And it's what we did in America to fight apartheid.
Yes.
And to help to free Nelson Mandela from jail.
Yes.
And my father, Clarence Mitchell Jr., was appointed by President Ford as the ambassador to the United Nations in 1975. Clarence Mitchell Jr. And it was incredible that he had a boy born in the alley. It was called Stockton Alley then, 1300 block of Stockton Alley, in between two livestock pens, and with cistern in the street to bathe yourself and get water and all that. And he then became he was associated with the following presidents: President Roosevelt, where he worked for Dr. Weaver and the Manpower. They were trying to get blacks jobs at these shipyards and other places, and they were recruiting blacks from around the country because Roosevelt wanted to issue the executive order, FEPC, Fair Employment Practice Commission, saying that blacks were entitled to jobs at these shipyards. And there was a famous shipyard right here in Baltimore. It was called Bethlehem Steel.
Yes.
And do you know the fact that blacks came there to work? There was the most incredible riot. Several people were killed. They burned, and it was incredible. And they had to segregate things, and that's why you ended up having two separate, a black union and a white union to work. But this is what Baltimore and Maryland's reaction to federal employment practice. So you got to know the history of Baltimore to understand. It goes deep. And because of that experience and knowing that my father went to the UN, and both at this time, this is 1975, claimed, and the Cold War was going on. We were still fighting Russia. And South Africa was in allegiance with America against Russia. And that's how we gave them nuclear arms and every kind of thing you could imagine. And overlooking their policy of apartheid, which was just a crude, and it's an Afrikaans word that means separate.
Yes.
And here, Kissinger, who was the secretary, he just
Henry
died.
Kissinger, yes.
Kissinger told my father he couldn't give the speech because South Africa was an ally. And everyone knew that the ANC, and my father had gotten word that they were being imprisoned, but the government said that all of these ANC people were hiding in Russia. And when my father accused them of barbarism in this apartheid system, the president of South Africa withdrew the South African ambassador to the UN and called my father a liar and challenged my father. He said, "You produced just one name of one person in South Africa being held illegally." Well, both are underestimated Clarence Mitchell Jr. because he produced over 5,000 ANC members who were among whom was Nelson Mandela. And so that, and then when he gave that, they burned my father's body in effigy, in Johannesburg, Pretoria, in Durban, and in Cape Town, all over South Africa. And then this is an actual recorded speech. When I say recorded, in the newspaper reporter capturing the words of the president and prime minister of South Africa saying that if Clarence Mitchell was on a plane flying anywhere over South African territory, he had given the order to the South African Air Force to shoot it out of the sky.
Have you ever met Nelson Mandela? I read his book.
Yeah,
you met
it and reread it because the strength of it. I met Nelson Mandela in 1994, and he was speaking. He was speaking at the commencement at Howard University, and you could have seen him after all those years of imprisonment. He stood tall, ramrod straight, and you could just grasp the charisma and the essence of his soul in terms of fighting this terrible system. And I shook his hand, and he just so firmly, and he hugged me, and I then became interested in it because of Mary McKeeba, all of that, and Hugh Masekela in South Africa. And then it culminated in me eventually becoming involved in this. My first sister state, Maryland, has a program. It was originally started by President Eisenhower, and it was to bring peoples of the world together. So Maryland had a program, and we had, France. You even had Russia, you had Ireland, you had Scotland, you had everybody but any African countries and not many South American countries that were black.
Yes.
And, had a substantial black population. Like you had maybe Argentina or something like that who had white rulers and things of that nature. And then all the countries like Ecuador and a couple of others where all the Nazis fled to. So the whole population is white. And but no one would do that. So my father, I then just went up and I will never forget, I was just so proud of my dad that day that he stood up to Henry Kissinger and all of them and for the first time gave the world. Nobody knew what was happening in South Africa because the president, everybody just taking it for granted that he was telling the truth. That these ANC members had gone to Russia. And sure enough, it was a lie. And so what my father's speech was galvanized support, that suddenly all these people again started realizing what Miriam Makeba was telling us about was true. And so all of these Americans, Randall Robinson, whose brother Max Robinson became the first black journalist to be on the ABC News. On evening news in America, and that was a feat. Imagine you turn on your evening television, and it ain't Walter Cronkite. It is Max Robinson, Randall Robinson's brother, and Randall Robinson turned this thing for Africa. But you will see in the early in the early history that in the 1880s, a group of black sailors ended up in South Africa, and we have the picture of the sailors, and which is part of an exhibition. So with this group, it's called American Voices Against Apartheid, whom one of the members is, of course, Susan Taylor, who's the publisher of Essence magazine, and then Dr. Gene Bailey, who is from Howard University, Dr. Charles Johnson from who's our historian, and then a number of other people, Ambassador Titus, and I happen to be fortunate enough to be a part of the group. But we put together and worked on it for some time and got a grant from the federal government and the State Department to do an exhibition about what we did in America to fight apartheid.
Awesome.
In May of this year, we put the exhibition in at the Apartheid Museum in South Africa.
Okay.
And it just got rave reviews, and I mean, it just... You could imagine that we served as voluntary docents to interpret the exhibition and tell people about it. And we really worked kind of around the clock because there was people came from all over South Africa, black and white, to see this exhibition. And we got the largest number of people ever to come to who came for any exhibition at the Apartheid Museum. Awesome. And it ran for quite a while in South Africa and just received, and someone from the Kennedy Center saw it. And then their board of trustees took a special plane trip to see it. And as a result, they invited the exhibition to come to the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. And it was introduced on September the 14th of this year. Okay. And it ran till November the 5th of this year. Awesome. And it again... matched and exceeded every kind of attendance record that ever happened at the Kennedy Center. Awesome. And then we are bringing the exhibition to Baltimore City. Okay. And it will be at the rotunda of Baltimore City's Hall, because we found that... When? Starting January the 9th. I mean 8th, because it's the first day before the legislature goes back. Okay. And and it'll be a magnificent thing. People should come down to City Hall starting on January the 8th. And it'll be here throughout Black History Month.
Name the venue and name it one more time.
Yes, and it's called American Voices Against Apartheid. It will be at Baltimore City's Hall, which is 100 Holiday Street, which is bounded by Fayette and Lexington Streets. Yes. And it will be in the rotunda of the City Hall, and it'll be an exhibition, it'll be panels of what role the Marylanders played in the fight against apartheid. It was including myself, my uncle, my brother Clarence, and other black legislators. Kwesi and Fumi, who's our congressman now, we all were locked up in front of the South African embassy in D.C.
Oh, man.
And in 1984, protesting apartheid. So, and then the other Marylanders who were involved in this protest, and then my uncle, Congressman Perrin Mitchell, there was a movement to disinvest funds in companies doing business in South Africa. And like Ford, General Motors, their major plants were in Pretoria, South Africa. And they supplied all the cars for Europe and everything else. And and then a lot of them were shipped to Baltimore and to the United States, having been made by enslaved people just about under apartheid and underpaid. And so the idea was, and most people get their money, corporations get it from pension funds. These giant, like the California Pension Fund has almost more than $1 trillion in funds. And so the people who want to do some business, like General Motors, Ford, and then Chrysler, all of them had heavy investments in their money came from all these pension funds from states across the country. So then Maxine Waters, who is still a black woman in Congress, California, she passed had passed the first law in California asking that California pension monies be disinvested from any company doing business with South Africa. That became the model for other people to use, so that my Uncle Perrin had a federal model, so there was a federal law passed, and even under Ronald Reagan, to be able to disinvest from companies, and it was signed into law. And then my brother Clarence did it who was a state senator, did it on the state of Maryland level. And then I was in the city council and joined with Kwesi and Fumi, who was a member of the city council then, to do it on the city level.
Awesome.
So all three of us were involved in the whole movement to do things. And there was a black preacher named Reverend Leon Sullivan, who was the first black to be on the board of General Motors Company. And then he was trying to do his best by having companies go by what was called, he established the Sullivan principles on how you do business in South Africa. But more people didn't want that because they just wanted apartheid abolished, that any continuation of it was abhorrent and bothered people. So it was important to mention that, because you know that this is how America continued its racism and throughout, but they did it, won't give us, we want to borrow something for a house, we got to put up our dogs, kittens, and grandchildren, and children yet unborn, before they give us meager amounts of money.
Yes.
And then and then on top of that, charges exorbitant interest rates, and usurious interest rates. So, and this is, yet all of these companies are getting their major funds, the automobiles, from public pension monies. And so that at least Maryland became the first southern state to ban investment in South African companies doing business in South Africa. I'm going to stop right here because I think I've ended on a note. The most important thing was to tell about the exhibition. But unfortunately, I could go on, but I'm not going to keep you up tonight. Because I have, as I was talking, other things came to mind. It's seminal experiences in my life, and to know that, the other thing I forgot to mention was that when my father went to Lincoln, Thurgood Marshall and Langston Hughes were a year or so ahead of my father. And they became his friends. And so Thurgood told my father, look, you're at the big time now. You're at Lincoln University. And you can't go by Clarence. We don't have any Clarences here. So we're going to name you Mike. On the condition that if you do have a son, you'll name him Michael. And finally, the third slot opened, and my father had 4 sons. And that's where my name comes from.
So Thurgood Marshall named you.
Named me. And then I have a poem. Really, it was called a lullaby, written by Langston Hughes on my birth, and which I have framed. And I just, what more could you have from life in that? These are people who were involved in.
Oh my God!
And
they changed. They
think of Langston
changed
Hughes' words when he talks about life for me ain't been no crystal stair, and the other kinds of things. And I'll close with this because
Go ahead.
most people don't, because this is because of Nelson Mandela. And he said he recited this repeatedly, almost daily.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the poem of Invictus.
Okay.
You know, and it's indelibly imprinted in my mind, and I can recite it morning, noon, and night verbatim from my memory. But it goes out of the wait just a minute. Black as the pit from pole to pole. I thank where their gods may be for my unconquerable soul. When in the fatal clutch of circumstance, I have not winced or cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody and bowed. Beyond this place of rafting tears looms but the horrors of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my God-given soul. That's what he recited, and that's Invictus.
Well, on that note, I have nothing else to say. All I can say.
I'm sorry to kept you up.
No, look, you do not have to apologize for anything. Tonight,
Yeah, you all right back there.
all I'm saying tonight is definitely an honor. We talking about a wealth of knowledge. We talking about a wealth of history. We talking about the people that you mentioned change America. We talking about change America. So the only reason we started this podcast is because of you and the backs of our ancestors that's telling our motto is your talent will make room for you. And the only reason we started this is because of the fight that y'all fought for us. And I'm telling the people now, we don't have the same fight.
Yeah.
Our only fight that we have now is inside of us.
Yeah, and to do look what you've done.
Look,
And achieved, and it's and come from things where you had not, and and like my father, and he eventually became kind of middle class, but he told us he never let us move from Druid Hill Avenue.
I understand.
He said, if you're going to fight for the people, you got to know what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
And then all the biggest crooks in Baltimore City were growing up in my neighborhood. This is West Baltimore now.
Yes.
And so the numbers writers and all the other people would come there, and then even little Anthony and the Imperials used to sing.
Anthony. Oh, really?
And,
okay.
At McCullough and Lafayette.
Yes.
And they'd be standing on the light pole, little Anthony and the Imperials singing.
Yes.
So it was quite a thing growing up, and then everybody be at our house to play ping pong, or then the resort, going up to the colored YMCA with our 15-meter swimming pool.
Yes.
Huh.
Senator, I love you to life.
Yeah, but thank you, man.
Family, there's nothing else I can say, but your talent will make room for you, and your talent's on the inside of you, and all I'm going to say, it's a wrap. Gotta.
It's a cold, cold world, a cold one. It's a cold, cold world. Yeah. It's a cold, cold world, a cold one. It's a cold, cold world.